The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the metal hulks arranged in perfect rows across the dusty parade ground. Tanks from every American conflict since World War II stood like silent sentinels of history, their gun barrels pointing toward distant mountains. The Harrington Tank Museum wasn't on any tourist maps. It wasn't meant to be. The men who came here weren't tourists. They were warriors coming to pay respects to the steel beasts that had carried them through hell. Retired Colonel James "Iron Jim" Harrington stood ramrod straight despite his 67 years, his weathered face a roadmap of battles fought across 4 decades of service. His eyes, sharp blue beneath a shock of white hair, surveyed his kingdom with quiet pride. The tanks weren't just machines to him. Each one held memories. Brothers lost, victories won, the cost of freedom paid in American blood and grit. "This beauty right here," Jim said, patting the massive hull of an M1 Abrams, "saved my life more times than my ex-wife." The small group of Vietnam veterans chuckled appreciatively. They understood. These weren't just stories to entertain civilians. This was shared history. "Desert Storm," Jim continued, running his hand along the composite armor. 72 hours of straight combat pushing into Iraq. Took 3 RPG hits and kept rolling. Best damn tank ever built. As the men moved deeper into the collection, Jim felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He normally wouldn't answer during a tour, but something made him check the screen. The name Doc Sullivan flashed insistently. "Gentlemen, take your time with the exhibits," Jim said, stepping away. "The coffee pot's full in the mess hall when you're ready." He walked several paces before answering, feeling a sudden knot in his stomach. Mike "Doc" Sullivan had been his best friend since their first deployment together in Vietnam. Doc never called during the day unless something was wrong. "Mike," Jim answered, his voice low, "what's going on?" The silence on the other end lasted just a beat too long. "Wild Bill is dead, Jim." The words hit like a physical blow. William "Wild Bill" Carson had been their demolitions expert in Desert Storm, part of their tight-knit tank crew that had forged bonds stronger than blood in the fires of combat. "What happened?" Jim asked, his voice steady despite the shock. "Car accident. Out near Flagstaff yesterday. Single vehicle went off the road into a ravine." Mike's voice sounded hollow. "But Jim, before he died, he sent something to you. Something important. He called me last week sounding paranoid. Said he'd finally found proof about Fortress Buster." Jim froze, his gaze automatically scanning the area around him to ensure no one was within earshot. Fortress Buster, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 30 years. A classified weapons project that had been buried so deep most people involved pretended it had never existed. "I'll be at your place in 3 hours," Jim said, ending the call without waiting for a response. He returned to the tour group, his professional demeanor never betraying the storm brewing inside him. But as he described the capabilities of an M60 Patton, his mind was 30 years in the past, in the scorching deserts of Iraq, watching as a specially modified tank obliterated reinforced bunkers like they were made of cardboard. By late afternoon, the veterans had departed, and Jim locked the main gates of his private museum. The collection represented his life's work after retiring from the military. Every tank restored with his own hands, each one a piece of American military history preserved for future generations. He climbed into his weathered Ford F-250, the suspension groaning under his weight. The truck had nearly 300,000 miles on it, but like its owner, refused to quit. The drive to Mike Sullivan's ranch outside Tucson would give him time to process the news about Carson. 3 men from their original crew of 5 were still alive, now just 2. The desert highways stretched before him, reminding him of convoy routes in Kuwait. Death had always stalked them. Why should retirement be any different? Mike Sullivan's ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The modest house sat nestled among mesquite trees, a small horse corral visible to one side. Mike had taken a different path after the military, becoming a weapons engineer for defense contractors before retiring to raise horses. His expertise had made him invaluable to the Fortress Buster project all those years ago. Jim pulled up to the house, dust billowing around his truck. Before he could exit, Mike emerged from the front door, his tall frame stooped with age now, his once black beard completely white. In his hands was a package wrapped in brown paper. "He mailed it to me," Mike said without preamble as Jim approached. "Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you immediately." The 2 men embraced briefly, the kind of quick, powerful hug that communicated everything words couldn't. 30 years of friendship, shared battlefields, Nightmares only the other would understand. "You think it was really an accident?" Jim asked, taking the package. Mike's expression darkened. "Sheriff's report says he went off the road at high speed. No brake marks. But Bill was a careful driver, always had been, even when we were dodging IEDs." Inside the house, Jim set the package on Mike's kitchen table. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with excessive amounts of packing tape. Written across the top in black marker, "For Colonel Harrington's eyes only." "He included this," Mike said, handing Jim a small digital voice recorder. "Said to listen to it before opening the package." Jim took the recorder, turning it over in his hands. Carson had always been technologically challenged. The fact that he'd used a digital recorder instead of a cassette tape spoke to the seriousness of the situation. Jim pressed play. Carson's gravelly voice filled the kitchen, sounding older and more strained than Jim remembered. "Jim, if you're hearing this, I'm probably dead. And it wasn't an accident. I've been digging into Fortress Buster for years now, trying to find out why they shut us down when the system worked perfectly. I found something, Jim. Something big. Everything's in the package. But you need to know they're watching me. Blackwood is still alive, and he's rebuilt the system. Bigger, deadlier, and he's planning to sell it. I tried to warn the right people, but no one would listen. You're the only one who can stop this. Trust no one except Doc and maybe your daughter. They'll come after you too once you open this. I'm sorry to put this on you, old friend. Semper Fi." The recording ended with a click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the kitchen. Jim and Mike exchanged glances, neither needing to voice the implications. "Blackwood," Mike said finally, practically spitting the name. "That son of a bitch." General Richard Blackwood had been their commanding officer during Desert Storm, the man who had championed the Fortress Buster project, then inexplicably ordered it terminated and all records sealed after its successful deployment. Now a powerful senator on the Armed Services Committee. "If Bill was right," Jim said, carefully cutting through the excessive tape on the package, "then Carson was murdered." Inside the package were several manila folders with top secret stamped across them in faded red ink, a small metal box sealed with tape, and a handwritten note on top. The metal box contained soil samples from the test site. "Do not open without proper protection. It's still hot." Jim's blood ran cold. Hot had only one meaning in their line of work: radioactive. He carefully set aside the metal box and opened the first folder. Inside were documents he'd never seen before. Technical schematics for the Fortress Buster system that went far beyond the information he'd been privy to as the tank commander. The weapon wasn't just an improved artillery system, as they'd been told. It was something far more devastating. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, looking over Jim's shoulder at the documents. "Depleted uranium penetrators with a secondary radiation dispersal effect? That wasn't in any briefing I received." "They lied to us," Jim said, his voice hard as he flipped through more pages. The bunker clearing capability wasn't just about kinetic force. It was designed to make the area uninhabitable afterward. The second folder contained surveillance photos. Recent ones dated just months ago. They showed a secure facility in the Nevada desert. And there, visible in one high-resolution image, was the unmistakable silhouette of a modified M60 tank with the distinctive extended barrel of the Fortress Buster system. "Someone's rebuilt it," Mike said unnecessarily. Jim nodded, his jaw tight. "And according to these shipping manifests Carson collected, they're preparing to move it soon." The final folder contained newspaper clippings about unusual cancer clusters in southern Iraq, in the exact regions where they had deployed Fortress Buster during Desert Storm. Medical reports, soil analysis. Carson had been thorough in his investigation. "We need to bring in Jennifer," Jim said finally, referring to his daughter. "She has the clearance and connections to verify this." Mike nodded in agreement. Major Jennifer Harrington had followed her father into the Army, but unlike Jim, she'd taken the intelligence route. Currently assigned to military technology assessment, she was positioned to access information they couldn't. "She's still at the Pentagon?" Mike asked. "Fort Belvoir," Jim corrected. "Technology Research Division." He pulled out his phone, then hesitated. If Carson was right about being watched. "Use my landline," Mike said, nodding toward an old rotary phone on the wall. "No one monitors those anymore." Jim dialed his daughter's private number from memory. It rang 4 times before her voicemail answered. He left a brief message asking her to call Mike's number as soon as possible, without explaining why. "Now we wait," Jim said, carefully repacking the documents. Mike opened his refrigerator and pulled out 2 beers. Might as well do it properly, he said, handing one to Jim. They sat in silence on Mike's back porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire. Neither man needed to speak. They'd shared too many silent vigils in far worse places. The images from the files kept replaying in Jim's mind. The specialized penetrator rounds, the radiation dispersal, the cancer clusters. Had they unknowingly been part of something monstrous? Had their mission to save American lives by taking out hardened enemy bunkers actually resulted in ongoing civilian casualties years after the war ended? The phone rang just after 9 p.m. Jim answered before the first ring completed. "Dad, what's going on?" Jennifer's voice was concerned but professional. "Jenny, I need you to come to Arizona immediately. It's about Fortress Buster." The silence on the other end told Jim all he needed to know. Despite being classified, the name still carried weight. "That project was terminated decades ago," Jennifer said carefully. "Bill Carson is dead. Suspicious car accident. He sent evidence that the project has been reactivated. Off the books." Another pause. "I'll be on the first flight tomorrow. Send me the address." She hung up without further questions. Jim replaced the receiver and turned to Mike. "She's coming tomorrow." Mike nodded, then pulled a small key from his pocket. "We should lock these files in my safe tonight. Come on, it's in the basement." They descended into Mike's basement, a space that had been converted into a combination workshop and secure storage for his collection of rare firearms. The gun safe was massive, a remnant from Mike's more paranoid days immediately after retirement. As Mike unlocked the safe, Jim's mind drifted back to '91, to the sweltering heat of the Iraqi desert, to the mission that had changed everything. February 1991, the ground invasion of Iraq was in full swing. Jim's tank battalion had been tasked with clearing a series of fortified bunkers near the Kuwait border. Intelligence had indicated they were command and control centers, heavily reinforced against conventional attacks. Their first attempt had been disastrous. Standard 120mm tank rounds barely scratched the reinforced concrete. They'd lost 2 tanks to hidden anti-tank positions, good men burned alive in their steel coffins. Jim had been furious, demanding better options from command. That was when General Blackwood had appeared, offering a solution. A classified weapon system that had been in development for years, based on technology captured from German World War II designs. The Bunker Knacker program, modernized with American engineering. Jim's crew had been selected to test the prototype. The modified M60 tank with its specialized 155mm gun had been a monster, requiring additional crew and support vehicles. But the results had been undeniable. Concrete bunkers that had withstood repeated bombing were reduced to rubble with a single shot. They'd cleared the entire sector in hours, saving countless American lives. Jim had been proud. They all had been. It wasn't until years later, when Carson started asking questions about unusual illness patterns among their support staff, that the doubts began. "Jim?" Mike's voice pulled him back to the present. "You with me, brother?" "Yeah," Jim said, blinking away the memories. "Just remembering." "Hard not to," Mike agreed, securing the files in the safe. "But we need to focus on the now. If Blackwood is really planning to sell this technology, then God help whoever ends up on the receiving end," Jim finished grimly. They returned upstairs in silence, each man lost in his thoughts. The implications were staggering. Not just the potential revival of a destructive weapon system, but the deliberate cover-up of its effects, and now possibly murder to keep it secret. "You should stay here tonight," Mike offered. "Guest rooms made up." Jim nodded gratefully. The weight of Carson's revelation had exhausted him more than he'd realized. As he settled into the spare bedroom, his phone chimed with a message from Jennifer. "Landing at Tucson International, 10:15 a.m. We'll rent car. See you around noon." He sent a quick acknowledgement, then tried to sleep. But his dreams were filled with burning tanks and the distant thunder of the massive Fortress Buster gun. And throughout the dreams, the face of General Blackwood watched with cold, calculating eyes. Morning arrived with the harsh brilliance unique to the Arizona desert. Jim woke before dawn, a habit from decades of military life. He found Mike already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, cleaning his old service pistol. "Expecting trouble?" Jim asked, eyeing the Beretta M9. "After that recording from Bill? You're damn right I am." Mike didn't look up from his methodical cleaning. "There's coffee, strong the way we had it in the sandbox." Jim poured himself a mug and sipped the bitter brew. It did indeed taste like the coffee they'd made during Desert Storm, almost thick enough to stand a spoon in. "We need a plan, Mike." Mike finally looked up, I've been thinking about that. Before Jennifer gets here, we should visit the old testing grounds. See if there's anything left that might corroborate Carson's files. Jim nodded slowly. Nevada testing range, Sector 7B. It's probably still restricted access. Mike's smile was grim. Good thing I kept my contractor badges. They'll get us through the first checkpoint at least. After that, well, we both still got our sidearms. The drive to the Nevada testing range took them north through the desert, past isolated towns and endless stretches of empty landscape. They'd swapped Jim's truck for Mike's more inconspicuous Jeep Cherokee, figuring it might attract less attention. As they approached the perimeter of the vast military testing facility, Jim studied the security setup. Not much had changed in 30 years. Chain link fence topped with razor wire, warning signs threatening prosecution for trespassing, a single guard checkpoint controlling access to the service road. Mike slowed as they approached, pulling out an ID badge that hung from his rearview mirror. "Follow my lead," he murmured. The guard was young, probably not even born when they'd been testing Fortress Buster. He examined Mike's contractor badge with bored efficiency. "Purpose of visit?" he asked. "Environmental assessment," Mike replied smoothly. "Checking radiation baselines for the Air Force." The guard nodded, barely glancing at Jim. "Sign in, please." He pushed a clipboard through the window. Mike signed with an illegible scrawl, and the guard waved them through. Once past the checkpoint, Jim let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Environmental assessment?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. Mike shrugged. Best way to explain why two old guys might be wandering around with radiation detectors, which, by the way, are under your seat. Jim reached down and found a small yellow Geiger counter. Military surplus, but still functional. You came prepared. Bill's warning about the soil samples got me thinking. If they really did test enhanced depleted uranium rounds out here, there should still be elevated radiation levels, even decades later. They drove for nearly an hour along dusty access roads, using old coordinates Mike had memorized years ago. The landscape was monotonously similar. Scrub brush, rocky outcroppings, distant mountains. But Mike navigated with confidence, finally pulling off onto a barely visible track. "This should be it," he said as the Jeep crested a small rise. "Firing range 7. Below them stretched a long, flat valley. At the far end, perhaps 2 miles distant, stood the crumbling remains of concrete structures, bunkers built to replicate Iraqi defenses, now abandoned to the desert. They parked and approached on foot, Geiger counters in hand. The devices remained silent at first, showing only normal background radiation. But as they neared the target area, the counters began to click with increasing frequency. "Still hot," Mike confirmed grimly, after all these years. The bunkers themselves were demolished, massive holes punched through reinforced concrete that had collapsed inward. Exactly the kind of devastation Jim remembered from Iraq. He circled one of the structures, examining the entry point of the specialized round. Clean penetration, he noted professionally. Detonation inside, maximum internal damage with minimal external blast effect. Perfect for taking out command centers while leaving surrounding structures intact. "And saturating the area with radiation," Mike added, holding up his Geiger counter, which was now clicking rapidly. "This isn't just depleted uranium, Jim. This is something worse. The levels are too high for conventional DU rounds." Jim was about to respond when the sound of an approaching vehicle reached them. They ducked behind the ruined bunker, peering cautiously around the edge. A black SUV with no markings was approaching from the main access road. It stopped about 100 yards from their position, and two men in tactical gear emerged. They weren't military, no insignia, no standard issue equipment. Private security carrying what looked like modified M4 carbines. "Centurion Defense," Mike whispered, pointing to a small logo visible on their body armor. Jim felt his blood pressure spike. Centurion Defense Systems was Senator Blackwood's private military contractor company formed after he left the Army. The company that, according to Carson's files, was developing the new version of Fortress Buster. "They're sweeping the area," Jim observed as the men began a methodical search pattern. "They must have been alerted when we signed in at the checkpoint. We need to move, now." Mike began backing away from the bunker, staying low. They retreated to their Jeep without being spotted, but as they pulled away, the black SUV appeared on the ridge behind them. "We've got company," Jim warned, checking the side mirror. Mike accelerated, sending dust billowing behind them. Let's see how they like a little evasive driving from two old desert rats. What followed was a tense chase across the testing range. Mike's experience with the terrain gave them an advantage, allowing him to navigate dry washes and rocky outcroppings that slowed their pursuers. By the time they reached the main gate, the black SUV was no longer visible in their mirrors. They signed out at the checkpoint as casually as possible, though Jim could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the Jeep's air conditioning. The guard barely looked up from his magazine as they passed. "That was too close," Jim said once they were back on the public highway. "They were expecting us," Mike replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Which means Carson was right. We're being watched." "Jennifer," Jim said, suddenly checking his watch. "She'll be landing in less than an hour. If they're monitoring us, they might be monitoring her too." Mike nodded grimly and accelerated, pushing the Jeep well above the speed limit. They reached Tucson International Airport with 15 minutes to spare before Jennifer's flight landed. Jim waited anxiously in the arrival area, scanning each face that emerged from the security checkpoint. He spotted her immediately. Tall and straight back like himself, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her strong features. Even in civilian clothes, Jennifer Harrington carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. Her expression remained neutral when she saw him, but her eyes, so like his own, narrowed slightly in concern. "Dad," she said simply as she approached, carrying only a small overnight bag. "Jenny," he replied, embracing her briefly. "Thank you for coming. Your message didn't leave much choice. Fortress Buster?" The last words were barely whispered. He nodded once. "Not here, we're being followed." Her eyes sharpened instantly, her posture subtly shifting to a more alert stance. He sometimes forgot that beneath the intelligence officer exterior was a soldier he'd personally taught to shoot and fight from the time she could walk. "Lead the way," she said calmly. They exited through a side entrance where Mike was waiting with the Jeep. Jennifer assessed him with a quick glance before climbing into the back seat without comment. "Major," Mike greeted her with a nod. "Dr. Sullivan," she returned formally. The two had a complex relationship. Respect mingled with the awkwardness that stemmed from Mike having known her since she was a child in pigtails. "We're heading back to the ranch," Mike explained as he pulled away from the curb. "We've got the files secured there." "What exactly am I looking at?" Jennifer asked, addressing her father. "Your message mentioned Carson." "Bill is dead," Jim said bluntly. "Car accident that wasn't an accident. Before he died, he sent us classified files proving that Fortress Buster has been reactivated, under private contract through Centurion Defense." Jennifer's intake of breath was sharp. "Senator Blackwood's company? That's a serious accusation." "We got more than accusations," Mike interjected. "We've got documentation, technical specs, shipping manifests. And this morning we visited the original test site. It's still hot, Jenny. Radiation levels well above what standard depleted uranium should produce, even after 30 years. She was silent for a long moment, processing this information. "If what you're saying is true, this goes beyond illegal weapons development. It's a violation of multiple treaties, not to mention the cover-up of environmental contamination. And murder," Jim added grimly. "Don't forget Carson." Jennifer studied her father's profile. "Why did he come to you with this? Why not go to the authorities?" Jim met her gaze in the rearview mirror. "Because I was there for the original deployment. I commanded the tank, Jenny. I fired the shots that took out those bunkers in Iraq. Whatever happened afterward, whatever they didn't tell us about the weapon, that's on me too." The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. Jennifer stared out the window at the passing desert landscape, her expression unreadable. Jim knew she was weighing options, calculating risks, formulating plans, exactly as he'd taught her to do in crisis situations. When they arrived at Mike's ranch, the sun was high overhead, baking the landscape. They quickly moved inside to the relative cool of the air conditioning. Mike immediately went to retrieve the files from his basement safe. Jennifer stood in the kitchen, her posture rigid, still processing everything she'd been told. "You know I've never asked about your classified work," Jim said quietly, "just like you never asked about mine. But this is different. People are dying, Jenny, still dying, years after the war ended, and now they want to sell this weapon to God knows who." "I understand the implications," she replied, her voice controlled. "But I need to see the evidence before I commit to anything." Mike returned with the files, spreading them across the kitchen table. Jennifer examined them methodically, her trained eye missing nothing. She spent extra time on the technical specifications, occasionally asking Mike for clarification on engineering details. "These are legitimate," she finally concluded, looking up from the documents. "The classification codes, the technical specs, the formatting, It all matches DoD protocols from that era. So you believe us? Jim asked. I believe the documents are authentic, she clarified. And based on what's here, I believe Carson had reason to be concerned. But there are proper channels for this kind of whistleblowing. Carson tried the proper channels, Mike countered. According to his notes, he approached 2 different inspector generals and a congressional oversight committee. No one would touch it because of Blackwood's influence. And now Carson is dead, Jim added. Jennifer's professional facade cracked slightly, showing the conflict beneath. What exactly do you want me to do? I can't just walk into the Pentagon with stolen classified documents. We need confirmation that the new system exists, Jim explained. Carson's files indicate it's being prepared for transfer to a foreign buyer. We need to know when and where, and we need leverage to stop it. You're talking about an unsanctioned intelligence operation against a United States senator, Jennifer said carefully. That's treason, Dad. No, Jim corrected, his voice hard. Selling a radioactive bunker buster to foreign powers is treason. We're trying to prevent it. Jennifer studied both men for a long moment, her training warring with her personal loyalties. Finally, she sighed. I can make some discreet inquiries. Check satellite imagery of known Centurion facilities. Maybe access movement permits for oversized military equipment. But that's it. If I find anything concrete, we take it through official channels. Agreed? Jim and Mike exchanged glances, then nodded reluctantly. I'll need a secure connection, Jennifer continued, in privacy. My office, Mike offered. The computer's clean and I've got military-grade encryption. As Jennifer set up in Mike's office, Jim stepped outside onto the porch, needing a moment alone with his thoughts. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. Carson's death, the implications of the weapon system he had once been proud to command, the danger he'd now drawn his daughter into. He pulled out his wallet and removed a faded photograph that he'd carried for decades. 5 men standing in front of their modified M60 tank in the Iraqi desert. Himself in the center as commander. Mike to his right as the weapons engineer. Carson grinning with his demolition gear. And their driver and loader, both lost in subsequent deployments. They'd looked so young, so confident, true believers in the mission, in the righteousness of their cause. The screen door creaked as Mike joined him on the porch. Penny for your thoughts, Mike said quietly, handing Jim a fresh coffee. Just remembering the team, Jim replied, showing him the photograph. We thought we were saving lives. We were, Mike insisted. Every bunker we took out meant American soldiers who didn't have to assault it on foot. We did our job with the information we had. But what if our job caused more suffering than it prevented? Jim countered. Those cancer clusters in Iraq, those are real people, Mike. Civilians, children. Mike had no answer for that. They stood in silence, watching heat mirages shimmer across the desert landscape. The screen door slammed open as Jennifer burst onto the porch, her face pale. I found it, she said without preamble. The new Fortress Buster. It's at a Centurion testing facility in Utah. And you're right. They're preparing it for transport. Export documentation was filed 3 days ago through a shell corporation. Final destination, classified, but the routing suggests the Middle East. Jim straightened, instantly alert. When? That's the problem, Jennifer replied. The transport is scheduled for tomorrow night. The 3 of them stared at each other as the implications sank in. Whatever they were going to do, they had less than 36 hours to do it. We need a plan, Jim said, his tactical mind already shifting into combat mode. And we need help. What kind of help? Jennifer asked warily. Jim's expression hardened with resolve. The kind that understands what's at stake. The kind that knows how to fight. Mike caught his meaning immediately. You're talking about the old unit, whoever's left. Jim nodded once. Brothers in arms, men who won't ask questions when it matters, men we can trust. That's a short list these days, Mike noted grimly. A lot of them are gone. But not all, Jim insisted. Make the calls. As Mike went inside to begin contacting their old comrades, Jennifer pulled her father aside. What exactly are you planning? She demanded quietly. This isn't some rogue mission in a war zone. This is the United States. There are laws. Jim looked at his daughter, seeing both the dedicated officer and the little girl he'd raised after her mother died of cancer when Jenny was just 12. The illness that had taken 3 years to claim her, the same slow death now plaguing veterans and civilians exposed to the weapon he'd commanded. Sometimes there's right and there's wrong, he said softly. And sometimes they don't align with the law. You've served long enough to know that. Jennifer held his gaze, then nodded once reluctantly. I'll help you gather intelligence. That's it. Whatever action you're planning, I can't be part of it. Fair enough, Jim agreed, but we need to move quickly. If that weapon leaves American soil— I know, she interrupted. Just be careful. This isn't like your other wars, Dad. Jim smiled sadly. War is always war, Jenny. Only the battlefield changes. Inside, Mike was already on the phone, speaking in the coded language of veterans, conveying urgency without explicit details. Jim took a moment to collect himself, to fortify his resolve for what was to come. In less than 2 days, they would either stop a weapon of mass destruction from falling into dangerous hands, or they would fail and become traitors to the country they'd spent their lives defending. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the Arizona sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Mike's ranch, Jim Harrington stood watch on the porch, scanning the distant road for signs of surveillance or approaching threats. The soldier in him, never fully retired, prepared for battle once more. The mission parameters were clear. The stakes were absolute. Failure was not an option. Just like in the desert 30 years ago, American lives depended on him. Only this time he was fighting against a threat of America's own making. Against a weapon he had once proudly commanded. Against the legacy of Fortress Buster. The battle for redemption had begun. Dawn broke over the Arizona desert with the swift certainty of a hammer strike. Jim Harrington stood on Mike Sullivan's porch, watching as the first rays of sunlight ignited the distant mountains. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, his mind churning with plans and contingencies. The soldier's instinct to prepare for battle never truly left a man. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Jennifer stepped out, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. She'd changed into civilian tactical wear, cargo pants, hiking boots, and a lightweight jacket despite the heat. Always prepared, just as he'd taught her. "You look like hell, Dad," she said, handing him a mug. Jim accepted the coffee with a grunt. "Used to go days without sleep during Desert Storm. You were 40 years younger then." He didn't argue the point. Age was the one enemy no soldier could defeat, no matter how stubborn. But what he'd lost in stamina, he'd gained in experience. And right now, experience was what they needed most. "Mike's made contact with 3 men from the old unit," Jennifer said, leaning against the porch railing. "They'll meet us at the rally point in Colorado tomorrow." Jim nodded. Colorado would put them within striking distance of the Centurion facility in Utah. "How reliable are they?" "Mike vouches for them. All former special forces, all with personal grudges against Blackwood." That was good. Personal motivation was stronger than patriotic duty sometimes, especially for an operation that existed in the gray areas between lawful and treasonous. "What about you?" Jim asked, studying his daughter's profile. "How far are you willing to go with this?" Jennifer didn't answer immediately. In the growing light, he could see the conflict in her expression. Military intelligence officers didn't exactly train for unsanctioned operations against U.S. senators. "I've secured 3 days of emergency family leave," she finally said. "That gives me plausible deniability for being away from Fort Belvoir. Beyond that," she shrugged, "I'll help you gather intelligence and formulate a strategy. The rest is your call." It was more than he'd hoped for. "Thank you, Jenny." She met his gaze directly. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because if what Carson found is true, then American soldiers and Iraqi civilians died because of what Blackwood covered up. And more will die if he sells this technology." Jim nodded. "Fair enough." The screen door opened again as Mike emerged, a map spread in his hands. "Our first stop needs to be Colorado," he announced without preamble. "Marcus Johnson lives in a cabin near Pikes Peak. If anyone knows the full capabilities of the Fortress Buster system, it's him." Jim's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Johnson's still alive? Last I heard, he was on death's doorstep with some mystery illness." "He was," Mike confirmed grimly. "Turns out it wasn't so mysterious. Radiation poisoning from his time operating the Fortress Buster. He's been living off the grid since 2010, when the VA stopped covering his treatments." "Bastards," Jim muttered. "We need to move," Mike continued. "I've got a contact at a private airfield outside Phoenix who owes me a favor. He can fly us to Colorado in his Cessna. No flight plan, no questions." Jennifer frowned. "That's a federal offense." "So is selling weapons of mass destruction to foreign powers," Mike countered. "Lesser of 2 evils, Major." She didn't argue further. 20 minutes later, they were packed and moving. Jim had brought little with him besides what he carried in his truck, an old Army duffel containing spare clothes, his sidearm, and a few personal items. The photograph of his tank crew was tucked securely in his wallet, The airfield was little more than a dirt strip with a corrugated metal hangar. Mike's contact turned out to be a Vietnam veteran with a prosthetic leg and a permanent scowl who introduced himself only as Chopper. "Sullivan, you old son of a bitch," Chopper greeted them, eyeing Jennifer suspiciously. "Didn't say nothing about bringing a lady." "She's with us," Mike assured him. "Army intelligence." Chopper's expression darkened further. "Don't much care for intelligence types. They tend to get good men killed with bad information." Jennifer met his gaze steadily. "I'm also Colonel Harrington's daughter." That seemed to carry more weight. Chopper looked to Jim, who nodded once. "All right then," the pilot conceded. "But this makes us square, Sullivan. After this, we're done." "Understood." The Cessna was an older model, but well-maintained. Jim helped load their sparse luggage while Chopper performed his pre-flight checks. Jennifer hung back, making a final scan of the surrounding area to ensure they weren't being watched. "All clear," she reported as she climbed aboard. The flight to Colorado took just under 3 hours, the small plane buffeted occasionally by mountain winds as they approached the Rockies. Chopper maintained radio silence for most of the journey, speaking only to point out landmarks below. They landed at another private airstrip, this one nestled in a valley between towering peaks. A rusted pickup truck was waiting for them, keys in the ignition, as Chopper had arranged. "Good luck with whatever the hell you're doing," the pilot said by way of farewell. "Try not to start World War III. The drive to Marcus Johnson's cabin took another 2 hours, the road deteriorating from pavement to gravel to little more than a rutted trail as they ascended into the mountains. Mike navigated from memory, having visited Johnson once before, several years earlier. "He won't be happy to see us," Mike warned as they made the final approach. "He's become a bit of a hermit, paranoid, keeps a shotgun by the door." "Can't blame him," Jim replied. "The government he served betrayed him, then left him to die." The cabin came into view as they rounded a bend, a small, weathered structure built of logs and stone, nearly invisible against the backdrop of pine trees. Smoke curled from a metal chimney despite the warm day, and a battered Jeep was parked to one side. Mike stopped the truck a respectable distance away and honked twice, a signal, Jim presumed, that had been arranged beforehand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the cabin door opened slightly, just enough for the barrel of a shotgun to poke through. "That's far enough," a raspy voice called out. "State your business." Mike stepped out of the truck, slowly, hands raised. "Marcus, it's Mike Sullivan. I called ahead, remember? I've brought Jim Harrington and his daughter Jennifer." The shotgun barrel didn't waver. "Prove it's really you." "Basra, 1991, Mike called back. "You, me, and Jim took shelter in that bombed-out school during the sandstorm. You had a flask of bourbon hidden in your gear, said it was for medicinal purposes." A dry chuckle emerged from the cabin, "And we drank the whole damn thing while waiting for the storm to pass." The shotgun barrel lowered and the door opened wider. "Come on in, quickly now." As they approached, Jim got his first look at Marcus Johnson in over 20 years. The man who emerged from the cabin bore little resemblance to the robust sergeant he remembered. Johnson was gaunt, his skin sallow, his once powerful frame now bent and thin. But his eyes, those were the same. Sharp, intelligent, and deeply suspicious. "Colonel," Johnson greeted Jim with a nod. "Been a long time." "Too long," Jim agreed, extending his hand. Johnson ignored the gesture, turning instead to Jennifer. "This your girl? The one who used to send you drawings when we were in the sandbox?" Jim nodded. "All grown up and outranking both of us now." That earned a thin smile from Johnson. "Good. Army needs more women in charge. Might knock some sense into the brass." He gestured toward the cabin. "Better get inside before someone spots you. These mountains have eyes these days." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat and well organized, though sparsely furnished. A wood stove provided heat, and solar panels on the roof apparently supplied what little electricity was needed. One wall was covered in maps and newspaper clippings connected by red string, the kind of conspiracy board Jim had seen in movies but never expected to encounter in real life. "It's not paranoia if they're really after you," Johnson said, noticing Jim's gaze. "Have a seat. Coffee's on the stove." They gathered around a rough-hewn table as Johnson poured coffee into mismatched mugs. His hands trembled slightly with the effort, Jim noticed. "Carson's dead," Mike said without preamble once they were all seated. Johnson nodded slowly. "I heard. Car accident, supposedly." His tone made clear what he thought of that explanation. "He sent us documentation about Fortress Buster before he died," Jim explained. "Technical specifications that went far beyond what we were briefed on. and evidence that Blackwood is developing a new version through his private company. Not just developing, Jennifer added, preparing to sell it. Export documentation was filed 3 days ago. Johnson didn't look surprised. I've been tracking their activities for years, since I figured out what was killing me. He tapped his chest. The cancer's in remission right now, but the doctors say it'll be back. Just a matter of time. The radiation levels at the test site are still elevated, Mike said. We checked yesterday, far higher than standard depleted uranium should produce. Johnson let out a bitter laugh. That's because it wasn't standard DU. The penetrator rounds had a secondary radiation dispersal component, designed to make bunkers uninhabitable after penetration. But they didn't tell us that part, did they? Jim felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. No, they didn't. They used us, Johnson continued, his voice hardening. Used all of us. The enhanced radiation was deliberate, part of the weapon's design from the beginning. Maximum area denial after penetration. But someone higher up decided the political fallout wasn't worth it if the truth got out. So they terminated the project, Mike said, and buried the evidence. Johnson nodded, along with anyone who asked too many questions. He rose with effort and moved to his conspiracy board, pointing to a section covered with photographs. These men were all associated with Fortress Buster, all died under suspicious circumstances over the past 30 years. Jim approached the board, recognizing several faces. Officers and engineers who had worked on the project, all officially victims of accidents or natural causes. And now Carson makes one more, Jennifer observed quietly. But why revive the project now, Jim asked, after all this time? Johnson's expression darkened further. Because the world has changed. The market has changed. There are buyers now willing to pay billions for a weapon that can penetrate any bunker and make the area uninhabitable for decades. Imagine being able to take out an enemy's hardened command structure and ensure they can never rebuild it. Nuclear fallout without the international condemnation of using actual nukes, Jennifer murmured. Exactly. Jim studied the board more carefully, noting the connections Johnson had mapped. How did you get all this information? Been collecting it for 20 years, Johnson replied. After I got sick, I started connecting dots. Then I found others, technicians, support staff, people who'd worked on the project and were also getting sick. We shared information. Most of them are dead now. He moved to a metal filing cabinet and unlocked it with a key from around his neck. Everything I have is in here, including something Carson didn't have, test footage of the final deployment in Iraq. That got everyone's attention. Johnson pulled out an old flash drive and handed it to Jennifer. The footage was classified above top secret, never meant to be seen by anyone outside the program leadership. Shows exactly what Fortress Buster did to those bunkers and the surrounding area. Jennifer accepted this drive carefully. How did you get this? A ghost of a smile crossed Johnson's gaunt face. I was the gunner, Major. The camera was mounted on my station. I made a copy before they collected all the equipment for decontamination. Jim felt a surge of both pride and concern. Pride that Johnson had had the foresight to preserve evidence. Concern about what that evidence might show. We need to see it, he said. Johnson nodded toward an ancient laptop on a side table. Be my guest. The footage was grainy and occasionally distorted, typical of military recording equipment from that era. But what it showed was unmistakable. The modified M60 tank, positioned on a ridge overlooking an Iraqi bunker complex. Johnson's voice could be heard calling out range and wind adjustments. Then Jim's voice, steady and professional, giving the fire command. The massive gun recoiled violently as it fired. The camera tracked the specialized round as it streaked toward the target, then a blinding flash as it hit the primary bunker. When the dust cleared, the reinforced concrete structure was simply gone. A perfect circular hole had been punched through it, as if a giant had driven a spike into the earth. But it was what happened next that made Jim's blood run cold. The surrounding area began to change color in the thermal imaging, a spreading pattern of heat that extended far beyond the blast radius. The ground itself appeared to be cooking, giving off radiation that the camera interpreted as heat. My God, Mike whispered. That's the secondary dispersal effect, Johnson explained clinically. The penetrator rod was designed to fragment after impact, scattering radioactive particles over a wide area. The heat you're seeing is actually radiation interacting with the camera sensors. The footage continued, showing several more bunkers being destroyed with similar results. In one sequence, figures could be seen fleeing from a structure moments before it was hit. The thermal bloom afterward engulfed them. They didn't appear again. Were those civilians? Jennifer asked sharply. Johnson nodded grimly. We were told all targets were confirmed military installations. But later intelligence suggested at least 2 of the bunkers had been repurposed as civilian shelters. We didn't know that at the time. Jim felt physically ill. He had given the fire orders. His finger had pulled the trigger. How many innocents had died not just from the direct hits, but from the radiation that continued to poison the area for decades afterward? This is worse than I imagined, he said quietly. It gets worse, Johnson replied. The new version Blackwood's company has developed is more efficient. Smaller dispersal radius but higher concentration. Designed specifically to target underground facilities while minimizing collateral damage to surface structures. Making it more marketable, Jennifer concluded. Less obvious environmental impact. Precisely. Mike, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Why didn't you come forward with this years ago, Marcus? Johnson gestured toward his frail body. I tried, first through official channels. Got nowhere. Then I went to a journalist. 3 days later, someone broke into my house and shot me twice in the chest, left me for dead. He pulled aside his shirt to reveal 2 puckered scars on his torso. I decided to disappear after that. Gathered information from the shadows, waited for the right moment. And now, Jim prompted, now Carson's dead and you're here. And Blackwood is about to sell this abomination to the highest bidder. Johnson fixed Jim with an intense stare. You commanded the original deployment, Colonel. You have the moral authority that I lack. People will listen to you. Jim wasn't so sure about that. A retired colonel with accusations against a sitting U.S. senator wouldn't get far without ironclad proof. The flash drive was damning, but it was also 30 years old. They needed evidence of the current operation. We need to document the new system, he said, thinking aloud. Get proof that it exists and is being prepared for export. Johnson nodded. I have the coordinates of the Centurion testing facility in Utah and facility schematics from a former employee who developed a conscience before his accidental drowning last year. He moved back to his filing cabinet and withdrew more documents. The new Fortress Buster is housed in Building 7, a hardened structure on the north side of the complex. Jennifer examined the schematics carefully. Security? Heavy. Private military contractors, former special forces mostly, motion sensors, infrared cameras, armed patrols. The works. Not impossible to penetrate, Jim assessed, his tactical mind already formulating approach vectors and contingencies. For someone with your background? No, not impossible, Johnson agreed. Dangerous as hell, but not impossible. Mike cleared his throat. We have 3 more men meeting us tomorrow, all former special ops, all trustworthy. Johnson raised an eyebrow. You're planning a direct action? Jim nodded slowly. If necessary. Our priority is documentation, concrete proof we can take to the proper authorities. But if the transfer is imminent, you'll destroy it, Johnson finished for him. Good, it needs to be destroyed. He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. I want in. The request hung in the air for a moment. Jim studied the man before him, once a strong, capable soldier, now ravaged by the very weapon he had operated. Johnson likely wouldn't survive a high-stress operation. Marcus, he began gently. Don't, Johnson cut him off. Don't tell me I'm too sick or too weak. This thing has been killing me for 30 years. I've earned the right to see it ended. Jim couldn't argue with that. All right, but you'll stay in the support vehicle, monitor communications. Be our eyes from the outside. Johnson didn't look happy about the limitation, but nodded his agreement. When do we move? Tomorrow, Jennifer answered. The shipping manifest Carson obtained indicates the system will be moved in 3 days. We need to act before it leaves the facility. Then we better get planning. Johnson spread the facility schematics across the table. The perimeter has 3 layers of security. Even with your special ops guys, a frontal approach would be suicide. Jim studied the layout, noting access roads, guard positions, and potential blind spots. We don't need to breach the main security. Just get close enough for visual confirmation and documentation. He pointed to a ridgeline overlooking the facility. From here, with good optics, we could observe the loading procedure. Get video evidence of the system being prepared for transport. And if observation isn't enough, Mike asked. Jim met his friend's gaze. Then we moved to Plan B, direct intervention. Jennifer's expression tightened with concern, but she didn't object outright. The team from the old unit, how reliable are they under pressure? The best, Mike assured her. Thomas Watson was Delta Force. Robert Chen was Ranger Reconnaissance. And Carlos Mendez was a Navy SEAL before transferring to Army Special Forces. All served under Blackwood at some point. All have personal reasons to want this operation to succeed. Jim nodded in agreement. He knew the men by reputation, if not personally. They were solid operators, even in their advanced years. We'll need equipment, Johnson pointed out. Surveillance gear, communications, weapons, if it comes to that. I've got a contact in Denver, Mike replied. Ex-CIA equipment specialist. Can get us what we need, no questions asked. Jennifer sighed audibly. More federal crimes to add to our growing list. Only if we get caught, Major, Johnson said with a thin smile. They spent the next several hours developing their plan, poring over the facility schematics and satellite imagery Jennifer had accessed through her military clearance. By evening, they had a workable strategy, a phased approach that would allow them to gather evidence without immediately committing to direct action. As darkness fell, Johnson insisted they stay the night in his cabin rather than risk driving the mountain roads after dark. The accommodations were cramped but serviceable. Jennifer took the single bedroom out of deference to her gender, while the men arranged themselves in the main room, Jim and Mike on ancient sofas, Johnson in his regular chair near the stove. Sleep proved elusive for Jim. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the thermal bloom from the Fortress Buster footage, imagining the invisible radiation spreading over the landscape, poisoning everything it touched. Had he known what the weapon truly did, would he have refused the fire order? He liked to think so, but in the heat of battle, with American lives at stake, the truth was he didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than any certainty could have. He rose before dawn, stepping outside to watch the sunrise over the mountains. The air was thin and cold at this elevation, shocking his lungs as he breathed deeply. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Johnson emerged, wrapped in a heavy blanket despite the mild spring temperature. Can't sleep worth a damn anymore, the former sergeant explained, joining Jim at the railing. Side effect of the treatments. Jim nodded in understanding. Beautiful up here. That's why I chose it. Wanted to spend whatever time I have left looking at something worth seeing. Johnson gestured toward the magnificent vista of peaks and valleys. Hard to believe we're about to risk our lives for a country that threw us away when we were no longer useful. Jim considered this. We're not doing it for the country. Not really. We're doing it for the people who would suffer if that weapon gets loose in the world. American, Iraqi, whoever. People who never signed up for the risks we did. Johnson grunted in acknowledgement. Noble sentiment, Colonel. Not noble, just right. They stood in silence for a while longer, watching as the sun's rays gradually illuminated the landscape, transforming shadow into brilliance one ridge at a time. You should know, Johnson said eventually, the new system isn't just a refinement of the old design. From what my sources tell me, it's been completely overhauled. Remote operation capability, advanced targeting systems. They're calling it Fortress Buster 2, but that's selling it short. It's a revolution in bunker penetration technology. Jim absorbed this information with growing concern. Automated targeting? AI-assisted. The operator inputs coordinates and the system calculates the optimal approach vector, accounting for structural weaknesses in the target. Makes it nearly foolproof, even in the hands of less trained personnel. The implications were disturbing. The original Fortress Buster had required skilled operators like Johnson, men with enough training to potentially question unusual orders. An automated system removed that human element, that potential for conscience. All the more reason to stop it, Jim said grimly. The others emerged from the cabin as the day brightened, drawn by the smell of coffee that Johnson had prepared. They ate a sparse breakfast of instant oatmeal and dried fruit, reviewing their plan one final time before packing to leave. Our rendezvous with the others is at a motel outside Grand Junction, Mike reminded them as they loaded their gear into the truck. From there, it's a straight shot to the Centurion facility near the Utah border. Johnson insisted on taking his own vehicle, the battered Jeep that had seen better days. No offense, but if things go sideways, I want transportation that can't be linked to any of you. Jim understood the precaution. We'll lead, you follow. Maintain calm silence unless absolutely necessary. The drive down from the mountains was tense but uneventful. As they merged onto the interstate heading west, Jennifer, who had taken over driving to allow Mike to rest, glanced at her father in the passenger seat. We're really doing this, she said, not quite a question. Having second thoughts, Jim asked. About a dozen per minute. She kept her eyes on the road. But then I remember what we saw in that footage, what they covered up, what they're planning to sell. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. I've spent my entire career believing I was serving a government that, despite its flaws, fundamentally stood for something good. This shakes that belief. Jim understood perfectly. It was the same crisis of faith he had experienced after learning the truth about Fortress Buster. Governments are just collections of people, Jenny. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. It's systems that matter, and right now the system has failed. When that happens, it falls to individuals to do what's right. She nodded slowly. I hope we're right about what that is. So did he. The motel outside Grand Junction was exactly the kind of anonymous, seen better days establishment that suited their purposes. Cash only, minimal staff, no security cameras. 3 men were waiting for them in room 114 as arranged. Jim recognized them immediately, though the years had changed them all. Thomas Watson, once the finest marksman in Delta Force, now white-haired but still ramrod straight. Robert Chen, the Ranger reconnaissance expert whose intelligence had saved countless lives during the Gulf War. And Carlos Mendez, the former SEAL whose demolitions expertise rivaled Carson's. Colonel, Watson greeted him with a crisp salute that belied his civilian status. Old habits died hard. Good to see you, sir. Likewise, Thomas, all of you. Jim returned the salute out of respect, then shook each man's hand in turn. Thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it, Mendez replied with a grim smile. Not after what Sullivan told us. The mood grew more serious as Mike made introductions all around, including Jennifer and Johnson to the newcomers. Then Jim laid out the situation in full. Carson's death, the evidence they'd gathered, and the imminent transfer of the new Fortress Buster system. Jesus Christ, Chen muttered when Jim finished. I always wondered why they shut down that program so abruptly. We were hearing rumors about its effectiveness all the way in Saudi. Blackwood's involved in this directly? Watson asked, his expression hardening. You're certain? Jim nodded. Centurion Defense Systems is his company. He chairs the board, makes all major decisions personally according to Carson's intelligence. Watson's jaw clenched visibly. There was clearly bad blood there, though Jim didn't know the specifics. Mike had mentioned that each man had personal reasons to participate beyond the obvious moral implications. What's the plan? Mendez asked, ever the pragmatist. Jim spread the satellite imagery and facility schematics across the motel room table. 3-phase operation. Phase 1 is surveillance. We position ourselves on this ridge, overlooking the facility and document activity, specifically focusing on Building 7 where the weapon is housed. Phase 2, if necessary, is infiltration. A small team enters the facility to place cameras and listening devices to gather more concrete evidence. Phase 3, only as a last resort if the transfer is imminent and we lack sufficient evidence, is direct intervention. Sabotage, Chen clarified. Precisely. The men studied the materials, asking pointed questions about security arrangements, response times, and extraction plans. These weren't amateurs or weekend warriors playing soldier. Despite their age, they approached the operation with the methodical precision of the elite operators they had once been. Doable, Watson concluded after a thorough review. Not easy, but doable. Equipment? Mendez inquired. Mike gestured toward several large duffel bags in the corner. Everything we discussed, courtesy of my contact in Denver. Surveillance gear, communication equipment, tactical gear, and if it comes to it, he unzipped one bag to reveal several disassembled rifles and handguns. Hardware. Jennifer looked uncomfortable at the sight of the weapons but didn't object. She had to know this might turn violent if they were discovered. We move at dusk, Jim decided. Watson, you'll take point on surveillance with your spotting expertise. Chen, you'll handle perimeter security. Mendez, be ready with the technical equipment. Johnson will remain in the support vehicle monitoring communications. Mike, Jennifer, and I will coordinate the overall operation. Everyone nodded in agreement. They spent the next several hours reviewing contingencies, establishing communication protocols, and familiarizing themselves with the equipment. By late afternoon, they were ready to move. They traveled in 2 vehicles, Mike's truck carrying Jim, Jennifer, Mike, and Watson, while Johnson's Jeep transported Chen, Mendez, and the bulkier equipment. They maintained a reasonable distance from each other on the highway, communicating via secure radios only when necessary. As they approached the Utah state line, Jim felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had preceded every combat mission of his career. Not fear exactly, but the body's natural response to imminent danger. The awareness that the next few hours could mean life or death success or failure. You okay, Dad? Jennifer asked quietly from the back seat. Just focused, he replied. But his mind was far from quiet. He was thinking about all the variables, all the things that could go wrong, and about the weapon they were trying to stop. A weapon he had once commanded with pride, never knowing its true nature or lasting consequences. The Centurion facility came into view just as the sun began to set behind the western mountains. From the main highway, it appeared to be nothing more than a typical defense contractor installation, a cluster of nondescript buildings surrounded by a perimeter fence with a guardhouse controlling access. Nothing to suggest a destructive powerhouse within. They drove past without slowing, continuing several miles before turning onto a dirt access road that wound into the hills overlooking the facility. Mike navigated carefully, avoiding ruts and washouts that might strand their vehicle. This is as far as we go by car, he announced, as they reached a small clearing sheltered by juniper trees. The rest is on foot. Johnson's Jeep pulled in behind them. The men disembarked quickly, retrieving equipment and conducting final checks. Watson assembled his high-powered spotting scope while Mendez unpacked the surveillance equipment, directional microphones, thermal imaging cameras, and a compact satellite uplink to secure the data they collected. Communications check, Jim ordered, and each team member confirmed their radio was functioning properly. Johnson, you stay with the vehicles, Jim instructed. Monitor all frequencies, especially Centurion's security channels. Give us early warning of any patrols or security responses. Johnson nodded, clearly disappointed to be left behind but accepting the necessity. His physical condition wouldn't allow for the strenuous hike to the observation position. Remember, this is primarily an intelligence-gathering operation, Jim reminded everyone. We document everything we can about the weapons system and its transfer preparations. Use of force is authorized only for self-defense, or if we determine the weapon is about to be moved and we have no other options to prevent it. With final instructions given, the team moved out, ascending the ridge in a staggered formation that minimized their visibility from below. The terrain was rough, loose shale and scrub brush that provided minimal cover, but the fading light worked in their favor, casting long shadows that helped conceal their movement. Watson took the lead, his eyes constantly scanning for security patrols or surveillance equipment. Chen brought up the rear, regularly checking their back trail to ensure they weren't being followed. The rest of the team moved in a tight formation between them, carrying the essential equipment for their mission. It took nearly an hour to reach the observation position, a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the Centurion facility while offering some concealment from below. Watson immediately set up his spotting scope, adjusting it with practiced precision. I have visual on Building 7, he reported quietly. Loading dock doors are open. There's activity inside. Looks like they're preparing something large for transport. Multiple personnel moving around what appears to be a modified tank chassis. Jim's pulse quickened. Can you get a clear image? Working on it. Watson attached a digital camera to the spotting scope and began capturing high-resolution photographs. Lighting conditions aren't ideal, but we should get usable imagery. Mendez, meanwhile, had set up the directional microphones, aiming them toward the loading dock. Getting some audio, mostly ambient noise, but occasional radio chatter. They're definitely preparing for a major movement. Jennifer positioned herself beside Watson, studying the facility through a pair of night vision binoculars. Security pattern is consistent with the intelligence we gathered. 2 man teams patrolling the perimeter at 15-minute intervals. Vehicle checkpoint at the main gate with 4 armed guards. Substantial, Jim noted. More than I'd expect for a routine defense contractor facility. Because what they're doing isn't routine, Mike said grimly. Watson suddenly stiffened. Movement at the rear entrance. VIP arrival. He adjusted the scope slightly. Black SUV, diplomatic plates. Can't make out the country of origin from this distance. The buyer, Jennifer whispered, they must be here for a final inspection before transfer. Jim felt a surge of urgency. If the buyers were already on site, the timeline might be accelerated. Watson, focus on getting clear imagery of whoever exits that vehicle. Mendez, see if you can boost the audio reception for any conversations near the loading dock. Both men acknowledged the instructions and adjusted their equipment accordingly. For several tense minutes, they observed as figures emerged from the SUV and were escorted into Building 7. Got them, Watson announced. 3 men, Middle Eastern appearance, being greeted by, holy shit. What? Jim demanded. It's Blackwood himself. Senator Blackwood is on site, personally overseeing this. Jennifer moved to verify through her own optics. Confirmed, that's definitely Senator Blackwood. This just got a lot more complicated. Indeed it had. Blackwood's personal presence elevated this from potentially deniable corporate malfeasance to direct involvement of a U.S. senator in illegal weapons sales. The implications were staggering. "Can you hear anything?" Jim asked Mendez. "Fragments only. Something about final demonstration and performance guarantees." Mendez adjusted his equipment further. "Wait, they're talking about a live fire test. Tonight." Jim exchanged alarmed glances with Mike. A live fire test of the Fortress Buster system would provide definitive evidence of its capabilities, exactly what they needed. But it also meant the weapon would be fully operational and ready for transfer. They must have a test range on the property, Mike reasoned, somewhere isolated where they can demonstrate the penetration capabilities without observation. Watson scanned the surrounding area with his scope. "There," he said after a moment, "about 2 miles east of the main facility. Looks like a purpose-built bunker structure with heavy reinforcement. Isolated from the main complex, accessible by a single road. Perfect for a demonstration to potential buyers," Jim agreed. "We need to document that test. It's our best opportunity to get conclusive evidence." Jennifer frowned. "That means splitting the team. Some stay here to monitor the main facility, others relocate to observe the test range." Jim considered this, weighing the risks against the potential intelligence value. "Watson, Mendez, you two stay here with the primary surveillance equipment. Continue monitoring preparations at Building 7. Mike, Jennifer, Chen, and I will relocate to observe the test range." "We'll need to move quickly," Chen pointed out. "If they're planning the demonstration for tonight, we don't have much time to get into position." Jim nodded in agreement. "Grab only essential equipment, night vision, compact cameras, basic communication gear. We travel light and fast." As they prepared to split up, Jennifer approached her father with evident concern. "This is higher risk than we planned for," she said quietly. "If they're conducting a live fire test, security around the range will be heightened." "Which is why I need you with me," Jim replied. "Your tactical assessment skills are the best among us. If anyone can find us a safe observation position, it's you." She didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded her acceptance. "Just remember what we agreed. Intelligence gathering only unless absolutely necessary." "That's still the mission," he assured her. They departed the primary observation post 15 minutes later, leaving Watson and Mendez to continue surveillance of the main facility. Chen took point as they navigated through the darkness toward the test range, moving as quietly as possible across the rugged terrain. Night vision goggles transformed the landscape into an eerie green panorama, allowing them to avoid obstacles that might cause noise or injury. It was slow going. The test range was situated in a depression surrounded by low hills, ideal for containing both the sound and visual evidence of weapons testing. They approached from the east, using a dry creek bed for concealment during the final approach. "Hold," Chen whispered suddenly, raising his fist in the universal military signal to stop. "Movement ahead." Jim froze, scanning through his night vision. A security patrol was visible about 200 yards ahead, 2 men with rifles moving along the perimeter of the test range. They were following a set pattern, walking the boundary of the facility at regular intervals. "Pattern indicates a 5-minute gap between passes," Chen observed after watching for several moments. "We can time our approach to avoid detection." Jim nodded his agreement. They waited until the patrol had passed, then moved quickly across the exposed ground to a position behind a cluster of boulders that offered both concealment and a clear view of the test range. The range itself was illuminated by powerful floodlights, revealing a stark, purpose-built facility. At one end stood what appeared to be a modified M60 tank chassis with an elongated barrel, unmistakably the new Fortress Buster system. At the other end, approximately 1 mile distant, stood a massive concrete structure clearly designed to simulate a hardened bunker. "There it is," Mike whispered, a mixture of professional fascination and moral disgust in his voice. "Fortress Buster 2. Jim studied the weapon through compact binoculars. The basic configuration was similar to the system he had commanded 30 years earlier, but with obvious modernizations. The barrel was more streamlined, the fire control systems more advanced, and most notably, there was no crew compartment. The entire system appeared to be designed for remote operation. "Automated targeting," Jennifer noted. Chilton nodded, confirming Johnson's intelligence. "They've removed the human element entirely." "Makes it more marketable," Mike agreed grimly. "No risk to operators, no possibility of crews refusing controversial orders." Chen had set up a compact camera with a powerful zoom lens, capturing detailed images of the weapon system. "We need to document the test itself," he reminded them. "That's what will prove its capabilities." Jim checked his watch. Based on the activity they were observing, the demonstration would likely begin soon. Personnel in Centurion uniforms were making final adjustments to the weapon, while a separate group had established an observation post at a safe distance, presumably for Blackwood and his guests. "There," Jennifer whispered, pointing to a convoy of vehicles approaching from the direction of the main facility. "That must be Blackwood and the buyers." Sure enough, the same black SUV they had observed earlier pulled up to the observation post, followed by two security vehicles. Figures emerged, though at this distance it was difficult to make positive identifications even with optical enhancement. "Recording everything," Chen confirmed, his camera whirring softly as it captured high-resolution video. For the next several minutes, they observed as what appeared to be a technical briefing took place at the observation post. Then the group moved to a control station positioned a safe distance from the weapon itself. Someone, likely a Centurion technician, appeared to be demonstrating the targeting system. "They're preparing to fire," Mike assessed, based on the positioning and body language of the group. Jim felt a strange sense of déjà vu, remembering his own position 30 years earlier, preparing to test the original Fortress Buster against simulated Iraqi bunkers. The same sense of anticipation, the same professional curiosity about the weapon's capabilities, but now mingled with the knowledge of what the weapon truly did, the lasting damage it caused. A warning klaxon sounded, echoing across the test range. The floodlights dimmed momentarily, then blazed back to full intensity. The weapon's barrel elevated slightly, adjusting for optimal firing trajectory. "Here it comes," Jim whispered. The firing sequence happened in near silence, a testament to the advanced suppression technology incorporated into the design. There was no massive recoil, no thunderous report that Jim remembered from the original system, just a muted thump and a flash from the barrel as the projectile was launched. The impact, however, was spectacular. The specialized round struck the concrete bunker with pinpoint accuracy, penetrating the reinforced structure as if it were paper. A millisecond later, the bunker simply collapsed inward, its structural integrity completely compromised. But it was what happened next that confirmed their worst fears. As the dust began to settle, the area around the bunker took on a strange, shimmering quality visible even through their optics. The ground itself seemed to ripple, and a faint luminescence spread outward from the impact point. "Radiation dispersal," Mike confirmed grimly, "just like the original, but more controlled, more concentrated." Chen's camera captured it all, the firing sequence, the penetration, and the aftermath. Definitive proof of what the weapon was designed to do. "We've got what we need," Jim said after several minutes of observation. "Let's fall back and rendezvous with the others." They began to withdraw carefully, maintaining the same stealth that had allowed them to approach undetected. But as they reached the dry creek bed that would provide cover for their retreat, Jennifer suddenly froze. "Movement," she hissed. 3 o'clock. Jim turned to look. A security patrol they hadn't accounted for was moving directly toward their position, using thermal imaging equipment that would render their concealment useless. "They must have expanded the security perimeter for the demonstration," Chen whispered. "Standard protocol." "Options?" Jim asked quietly. "Limited," Jennifer replied, assessing the situation with professional detachment. "They'll spot us if we move. Creek bed is our only cover, but they're heading straight for it." "Diversion," Mike suggested. "Draw them away from our position." Jim considered this briefly. "Too risky. They'll call for backup at the first sign of intruders." He made a quick decision. "We hold position. Let them pass as close as they need to, then we move once they're clear." It was their best option, but far from ideal. The patrol was using systematic search patterns that would bring them within meters of the team's position. Detection seemed almost inevitable. "Flatten out," Jim ordered. "Minimize heat signatures. Power down all equipment except essential comms." They complied immediately, pressing themselves against the cool ground and covering any exposed equipment that might reflect light or emit heat. Jim maintained visual contact with the approaching patrol, tracking their movement through a narrow gap in the rocks. The security team was now less than 50 yards away, moving deliberately, sweeping the area with their thermal gear. Jim could hear fragments of their radio communications, routine status reports that suggested they hadn't detected anything unusual yet. 30 yards? 20. The patrol was now close enough that Jim could make out the insignias on their tactical gear. Centurion Defense Systems private security, former military, by their bearing and movement patterns. Then disaster. A small stone, dislodged by Chen's slight adjustment of position, rolled down the slope and clattered against larger rocks below. The sound was minimal, but in the tense silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. The patrol froze instantly. "You hear that?" one of them said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Area 4, possible movement," the other responded into his radio. "Investigating now." Jim locked eyes with Jennifer, both of them recognizing that detection was now virtually certain. She subtly shifted her hand toward her sidearm, a questioning look in her eyes. Jim gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Engaging the patrol would escalate the situation beyond recovery. The security team was moving directly toward their position now, weapons raised, thermal imaging equipment scanning the exact spot where they were concealed. "I've got heat signatures," one of them announced. "Multiple contacts behind those rocks." "Central, this is Patrol 7, the other spoke into his radio. "We have potential intruders at the east perimeter of the test range. Requesting backup." Jim made an instant decision. "Chen, demonstration footage secure?" "Encrypted and transmitted to Johnson at the support vehicle," Chen confirmed quietly. "Then we have what we came for," Jim said. "On my signal, we fall back to extraction point Charlie. Maintain noise and light discipline, no engagement unless absolutely necessary." They all nodded their understanding. Jim waited until the security patrol had moved slightly past their direct line of position, then gave the hand signal to move. They began withdrawing silently through the creek bed, using its natural depression as cover. Behind them, they could hear the security team discovering their previous position, radio chatter indicating that a facility-wide alert was now in progress. "We have about 10 minutes before this entire area is swarming with security," Jennifer assessed as they increased their pace, still maintaining reasonable stealth. "Extraction point Charlie is 8 minutes away at this pace," Chen calculated. "We'll make it, but it will be close." Jim activated his secure radio. "Watchdog, this is Pathfinder. Mission accomplished, but we're compromised. Security alert in progress, moving to extraction point. Charlie, have transport ready." Johnson's voice came back immediately. "Understood, Pathfinder. Transport standing by. Be advised, I'm monitoring increased radio traffic from the facility. They're mobilizing all security teams." "What about Eagle and Hammer?" Jim asked, using the call signs for Watson and Mendez. "Already extracted and en route to Rally Point," Johnson confirmed. "They'll meet us there." That was something, at least. Half their team was clear. Now they just needed to make it back themselves before the entire area was locked down. They moved as quickly as caution would allow, using natural terrain features for concealment whenever possible. Behind them, they could see flashlights and hear vehicles as the Centurion security teams expanded their search. "They're establishing a perimeter," Jennifer observed. "Standard containment protocol. They'll work inwards systematically until they find something." "Or someone," Mike added grimly. They pressed on, the extraction point now less than half a mile away. But the security response was expanding rapidly, with vehicles visible on the main access road and what sounded like a helicopter approaching from the south. "They're taking this very seriously," Chen noted. "This isn't standard security response for a defense contractor. This is military-grade containment." "Because they know exactly what's at stake," Jim replied. "If evidence of that weapon gets out, Blackwood is finished." They reached the final approach to extraction point Charlie, a small clearing where Johnson should be waiting with the vehicles. But as they prepared to break cover, Jennifer suddenly grabbed Jim's arm. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "Look." Jim followed her gaze and felt his heart sink. The clearing was occupied, not by Johnson and their vehicles, but by a Centurion security team establishing a roadblock. Their extraction point had been compromised. "They must have triangulated our radio transmissions," Mike said quietly. "Or they've simply blocked all possible exit routes," Chen suggested. "Standard procedure for perimeter containment. Either way, their planned escape route was no longer viable." Jim quickly assessed their options. None of them good. "Alternate extraction point Delta is 2 miles northwest," he said after a moment's consideration. "Difficult terrain, but it might still be clear." "That's assuming Johnson received the alert and relocated there," Jennifer pointed out. "If he's still waiting at Charlie," she didn't need to finish the thought. If Johnson hadn't adapted to the changing situation, he might already be in Centurion custody. Jim made another quick decision. "Mike, you and Chen proceed to extraction point Delta. Jennifer and I will circle back and verify Johnson's status. If he's been compromised, we'll attempt to extract him. If not, we'll redirect him to Delta. Split up? That's high risk, Mike objected. Lower risk than all of us being captured together, Jim countered. The evidence is what matters now. Chen has the footage. You two need to get it out, no matter what. Mike clearly didn't like it, but nodded his agreement. Rendezvous at the contingency location if we're separated for more than 6 hours. Understood. With a brief clasping of hands that might be their final contact, the team split. Mike and Chen disappeared into the darkness heading northwest, while Jim and Jennifer began a careful circuit around the compromised extraction point, seeking any sign of Johnson and their vehicles. This isn't how I expected this operation to go, Jennifer said quietly as they moved through the brush. They rarely do, Jim replied, the voice of experience. The best plans survive until first contact, then it's all adaptation. She managed a tight smile at the familiar military adage. At least we got what we came for. Proof that the weapon exists and is being prepared for transfer, evidence of its capabilities. Assuming Chen and Mike make it out with that evidence, Jim reminded her. They will, Jennifer said with more confidence than Jim felt. They're good at what they do. They continued their careful movement, avoiding the roving security patrols that were now scouring the area with increasing intensity. The helicopter they'd heard earlier was now visible, sweeping the terrain with a powerful spotlight that forced them to freeze and cover several times as it passed overhead. This is a massive response for a simple security breach, Jennifer noted. During one such pause, they're acting like this is a major military operation. Because for them, it is, Jim replied. If evidence of that weapon gets out, with Blackwood personally overseeing its sale to foreign buyers, it's not just prison time. It's the end of his career, his reputation, everything. After nearly 40 minutes of careful movement, they reached a vantage point that allowed them to observe the original extraction point from concealment. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. Johnson's Jeep was there, surrounded by Centurion security personnel. Of Johnson himself, there was no sign. He had either been captured or had managed to escape on foot. No sign of Mike's truck, Jennifer observed. That's something, at least. Jim nodded in agreement. Johnson must have warned Mike and the others before his position was compromised. We need to assume Johnson has been taken, he said grimly, which means we need to adjust our plans accordingly. Extraction point Delta, Jennifer suggested. Too risky now. They'll be covering all the obvious extraction routes. Jim considered their options. We need to go deeper into the hills, find a position to lay low until the initial search dies down. And then we make our way back to the contingency rendezvous point. Connect with Mike and the others if they made it out. Jennifer nodded, though Jim could see the concern in her eyes. They were now effectively cut off behind enemy lines, with an intensifying search closing in around them. We'll make it, he assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced himself. They began moving again, heading away from the search teams into the more rugged terrain to the northeast. It would mean a longer journey back to civilization eventually, but it offered their best chance of immediate evasion. As they climbed higher into the hills, the sounds of the security response began to fade behind them. But Jim knew this was only temporary. By morning, Centurion would have expanded their search perimeter, bringing in more resources, possibly even calling in favors from official agencies under some pretext. They needed to find a defensible position to rest and regroup, somewhere they could evaluate their situation more thoroughly and plan their next move. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they located a suitable shelter, a shallow cave formed by an overhanging rock formation, screened from view by dense brush. It wasn't ideal, but it would conceal them from both ground searches and aerial surveillance. We'll rest here until nightfall, Jim decided. Move again under cover of darkness. Jennifer nodded wearily. The night's exertion had taken a toll on both of them. They arranged themselves in the limited shelter, rationing the small amount of water and energy bars they carried for emergencies. Do you think they got out? Jennifer asked after a while. Mike and the others? Jim wanted to offer reassurance, but he wouldn't lie to her. Mike's smart, resourceful. If anyone could adapt to the situation, it's him. That's not really an answer, she observed. No, Jim admitted, it's not. They lapsed into silence, both contemplating the same grim possibilities. If Mike and Chen had been captured, if the evidence had been seized, then everything they had risked would be for nothing. Worse, they would likely face federal charges for trespassing on a defense contractor's property, possibly even espionage given the classified nature of what they had witnessed. Get some rest, Jim finally said. I'll take first watch. Jennifer didn't argue, settling herself as comfortably as possible against the rock wall of their shelter. Within minutes, her breathing had steadied into the rhythm of sleep, a soldier's ability to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. Jim remained vigilant, watching the landscape below for any sign of approaching search teams. But his mind was far from quiet. He was thinking about Johnson, potentially in Centurion custody, about Mike and the others, their fate unknown, about the weapon they had witnessed, a refined version of the system he had once commanded with pride, never knowing its true nature. And he thought about the decisions that had led him here, a retired colonel hiding in the wilderness, branded a trespasser or worse, all to expose a truth that powerful forces wanted to keep hidden. He had no regrets. Whatever happened next, they had documented the existence of Fortress Buster II. They had evidence of its capabilities, of Blackwood's direct involvement in its sale to foreign buyers. If that evidence reached the right authorities, it would be enough to stop the transfer and bring those responsible to justice. But first, they had to survive long enough to deliver it. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light across the desert landscape, Jim settled in for what promised to be a long and uncertain wait. The mission parameters had changed. The stakes had escalated, but the objective remained the same. Stop Fortress Buster, whatever the cost. Dusk settled over the Utah wilderness, painting the rugged landscape in deepening shades of purple and blue. Jim Harrington hadn't moved from his position at the mouth of the shallow cave for nearly 12 hours, his weathered eyes constantly scanning the terrain below for signs of pursuit. Beside him, Jennifer slept fitfully, decades of military discipline allowing her to rest despite their precarious situation. A faint sound from outside their shelter caused Jim to freeze, his hand instinctively moving to the sidearm at his hip. He listened, filtering the natural sounds of the desert evening from potential threats. There it was again, the subtle displacement of loose rock, too deliberate to be wildlife. He nudged Jennifer awake with a gentle touch to her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open instantly, alert without the grogginess civilians would display. Jim pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed toward the source of the sound. She nodded once, silently drawing her own weapon. They positioned themselves on either side of the cave entrance, backs pressed against the cool stone. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft crackle of a radio being adjusted. Jim exchanged a glance with Jennifer, both preparing for the worst. A shadow fell across the entrance. Jim tensed, ready to spring, but then a familiar voice whispered into the gathering darkness. "Pathfinder, this is Watchdog. You in there?" Relief flooded through Jim. "Marcus," he called softly, keeping his voice low. "That you?" Johnson appeared at the entrance, looking even more haggard than when they'd last seen him, if that was possible. His clothes were torn, his face scratched and dirty, but his eyes gleamed with the same fierce determination. "You're a hard man to find, Colonel," Johnson said, slumping against the rock wall as Jim pulled him inside. "Been tracking you since dawn." "How did you escape?" Jennifer asked, holstering her weapon. "We saw your jeep surrounded by Centurion security." Johnson's thin lips curved into a grim smile. "Left them a little surprise package in the glove compartment. Military-grade smoke grenade. When they popped the lock, I was already 50 yards away in the brush." "And the others?" Jim asked urgently. "Mike? Watson, did they make it out?" Johnson's expression sobered. "Chen and Sullivan reached the alternate extraction point. Last transmission I received before I had to ditch my radio indicated they were clear and moving toward the rendezvous. Watson and Mendez were already there." "And the evidence?" Jennifer pressed. "The footage of the test?" "Transmitted to a secure server before the Centurion team jammed our communications. We've got it, solid and secure." Jim allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mission's primary objective had been accomplished. They had documented the existence of Fortress Buster II and its radiation dispersal capabilities. They had evidence of Blackwood's direct involvement in its sale to foreign buyers. Now they just needed to deliver that evidence to the proper authorities. "What's the situation down there?" he asked, nodding toward the facility below. Johnson eased himself to a sitting position. His breathing labored from the climb. "Full lockdown. They've called in every security contractor within 100 miles. Roadblocks on all major highways. Helicopter patrols. They're treating this like a major national security breach." "Which it is," Jennifer pointed out. "Just not in the way they're presenting it." Jim considered their options. Their original extraction plan was clearly no longer viable. They needed a new approach. The contingency rendezvous is 100 miles from here, he said. On foot, across this terrain, it would take days. Days we don't have if they're expanding the search. I've got a better option, Johnson replied. There's an old friend of mine from the First Gulf War, runs a small airfield about 20 miles northeast of here, flies wildlife researchers into the backcountry. If we can reach him, he might get us out under the radar. Can he be trusted? Jennifer asked. He lost both legs to Gulf War syndrome, blamed it on the government cover-up of chemical exposures. Yeah, he can be trusted. Jim nodded. It was their best option. We move at full dark, 20 miles rough terrain. Can you make it, Marcus? Johnson's face hardened with resolve. I've been dying for 30 years, Colonel. I can manage another 20 miles. They prepared as best they could with limited supplies. Jennifer tore strips from her undershirt to bind Johnson's bleeding feet, worn raw from his trek to find them. Jim studied the crude map Johnson had drawn, memorizing the route to the airfield. By the time full darkness descended, they were ready to move. They traveled in silence through the night, using natural terrain features for concealment whenever possible. Johnson struggled to keep pace but refused any suggestion of rest. His determination was fueled by something beyond physical endurance, the chance to finally expose the truth that had been killing him for decades. They had covered perhaps 7 miles when the distant thrum of helicopter rotors reached them. Jim signaled for immediate concealment, and they pressed themselves into the shadow of a large rock formation. The aircraft appeared moments later, sweeping a powerful spotlight across the landscape in methodical patterns. They're expanding the search perimeter, Jennifer whispered as the light passed overhead. Widening the net. Makes sense, Jim replied. They can't risk word getting out about what we saw. The helicopter completed its sweep and moved on, but its presence confirmed that their window of opportunity was closing. If they couldn't reach Johnson's contact by dawn, their chances of escape would diminish dramatically. They pushed on, each mile more arduous than the last. Johnson's condition deteriorated visibly, his breathing becoming more labored, his steps more uncertain. But he refused to stop, refused to be left behind. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they crested a ridge and spotted a small cluster of buildings in the valley below. A single airstrip of packed dirt, a metal hangar, and what appeared to be a modest house. No lights, no signs of activity. That's it, Johnson confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. McMurray's place. They approached cautiously, aware that Centurion's search net might have already reached this far. No vehicles were visible, no indication that the property was being watched, but Jim wasn't taking chances. He instructed Jennifer to remain with Johnson in the cover of the trees while he conducted a closer reconnaissance. The property appeared deserted as Jim circled it. The hangar doors were closed, the house dark. He was about to signal the others forward when the distinctive click of a rifle being cocked froze him in place. That's far enough, friend, a gruff voice called from behind him. Hands where I can see him. Jim slowly raised his hands. I'm looking for McMurray. Marcus Johnson sent me. A pause. Marcus Johnson's been dead for years. Try again. Not dead yet, Johnson's voice rang out as he emerged from the trees, Jennifer supporting him. But working on it, Mac. The rifle barrel lowered. Jesus Christ, Marcus. You look like hell warmed over. Feel worse, Johnson replied. This is Colonel Harrington and his daughter. They need a ride, and they need it quiet. McMurray stepped into view, a sturdy man in his 60s with a full beard and the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen combat. He was seated in a rugged all-terrain wheelchair, both legs missing above the knee, but he handled the rifle with practiced ease. Centurion's got the whole area locked down, he said. Military-grade search operation. What did you folks do? Steal their silverware? We documented their new Fortress Buster system, Jim replied, and their plans to sell it to foreign buyers. McMurray's expression hardened. Fortress Buster. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long while. He studied them for a moment, then nodded toward the house. Come on, we need to talk inside. The interior of the house was Spartan but comfortable, the walls adorned with aviation memorabilia and military photographs. McMurray wheeled himself to a communications console in one corner and began checking frequencies. They're monitoring everything, he reported, air traffic, phones, radio. Whatever you saw, they're desperate to keep it contained. Can you get us out? Jim asked directly. McMurray considered this. Got a Cessna 172 in the hangar. 4 seats, decent range. I could get you as far as Colorado maybe, but not until nightfall. Daylight flight would be spotted immediately. Jennifer frowned. We may not have until nightfall if they're expanding the search in this direction. We'll have to risk it, Jim decided. The evidence we've gathered is too important to lose. Johnson, who had collapsed into a chair upon entering the house, suddenly stiffened. Aircraft, he warned, coming in from the south. They doused the lights and moved to the windows. A helicopter was visible in the distance, flying a search pattern similar to the one they'd evaded earlier. But this one was on a trajectory that would bring it directly over the airfield. Routine patrol, or are they tracking us? Jennifer wondered aloud. Doesn't matter, McMurray replied grimly. If they spot my plane, they'll investigate. Standing policy for all aircraft in the region right now. Jim made a quick decision. How fast can you get that Cessna ready to fly? 20 minutes, McMurray answered, but in broad daylight. We don't have a choice, Jim cut him off. That helicopter reaches us. We're done. We need to be in the air before they arrive. McMurray nodded once, then wheeled himself rapidly toward the door. I'll prep the plane. Get anything you need from the house. There's a rifle cabinet in the bedroom. Help yourselves. The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of focused activity. Jennifer gathered supplies while Jim selected weapons from McMurray's extensive collection. Johnson, despite his condition, insisted on helping, loading ammunition and essential gear. The helicopter was now close enough that the thrum of its rotors vibrated through the walls of the house. McMurray had the Cessna rolled out onto the airstrip, its engine already warming up. We're almost out of time, Jim observed, watching the approaching aircraft. That bird spots the plane. They'll call in everything they've got. Then we'll have to give them something else to focus on, Johnson said quietly. Jim turned to find the former sergeant loading rounds into a belt-fed machine gun, a relic from Vietnam by the look of it, but well-maintained. Marcus? Jim began, already sensing what his old comrade was planning. No. This is my fight too, Colonel, Johnson replied, his gaunt face set with determination. Has been for 30 years. You need a diversion to get airborne. I'll give you one. We're not leaving you behind, Jennifer insisted. Johnson smiled thinly. I'm already dead, Major. Cancer's in remission now, but the doctors gave me 6 months tops before it comes back. This way, my death means something. Jim wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but the tactician in him knew Johnson was right. They needed a diversion and they were out of options. Marcus, he began. Don't make it a long goodbye, Jim, Johnson interrupted. Just make sure this gets out. Make sure they can't bury it again. Jim clasped his old comrade's hand firmly. I promise. They moved quickly to the airstrip where McMurray had the Cessna ready, propeller spinning. The helicopter was now visible on the horizon, perhaps 2 minutes out. Johnson positioned himself at the edge of the property with the machine gun, using a fallen log as a makeshift mount. Get in, McMurray ordered as they reached the plane. I'll need full throttle from the start. It's going to be tight. Jim helped load their supplies, then paused, looking back at Johnson's solitary figure. The former sergeant raised a hand in farewell, then turned his attention to the approaching helicopter. The Cessna's engine roared as McMurray pushed it to full power. The small plane lurched forward, bumping along the dirt airstrip as it gathered speed. Behind them, the first burst from Johnson's machine gun echoed across the valley. Jim watched through the window as Johnson opened fire on the helicopter, not aiming to hit it, but creating enough of a threat to force it to respond. The aircraft banked sharply, its spotlight swinging toward the source of fire, away from the airstrip. The Cessna lifted off just as the helicopter circled back, its spotlight sweeping across the property. McMurray kept the plane low, following the contours of the valley to minimize their radar profile. He gave us the time we needed, Jennifer said quietly as the sounds of gunfire faded behind them. They'll focus on him, not us. Jim nodded, unable to speak. Another sacrifice in a war that had claimed too many lives already. Another debt he could never repay. McMurray piloted with the skill of someone who knew every inch of the landscape. He kept the Cessna below radar coverage, threading between mountains and following river valleys. Twice they spotted search aircraft in the distance, but McMurray's evasive routing kept them clear. I can get you to Grand Junction, he said after nearly an hour of flight. Small airfield on the outskirts. Friend of mine manages it. He can arrange ground transport. Our team will be at the contingency rendezvous point, Jim replied. A hunting lodge outside Durango. Can you get us close? McMurray considered this. There's a private strip about 30 miles from Durango. Not ideal, but doable. Fuel's going to be tight, though. Do it, Jim decided. We need to reconnect with the others as quickly as possible. The flight to the private airstrip passed without incident, though fuel gauges were flashing warnings as they touched down on the rough runway. A caretaker, surprised by their arrival, provided them with an ancient pickup truck in exchange for a generous amount of cash from McMurray's emergency fund. "This is as far as I go," the pilot said as they loaded their gear into the truck. "Gotta get back before they connect my plane to your escape." Jim clasped his hand firmly. "Thank you for everything." McMurray nodded grimly. "Just make those bastards pay. For Marcus, for me, for all of us they've thrown away." The drive to the hunting lodge took another 2 hours along winding mountain roads. Jim remained vigilant throughout, watching for any sign of pursuit, but the remote route seemed clear. As they approached the rendezvous point, he instructed Jennifer to signal their arrival using the recognition protocol they'd established. 3 short flashes of the headlights. Pause, 2 more flashes. The lodge appeared deserted at first glance. No vehicles visible, no lights in the windows. But as they pulled into the clearing, the main door opened and Mike Sullivan emerged, rifle at the ready. Relief washed over his face as he recognized them. "Thank God," he said as they exited the vehicle. "We were starting to think you didn't make it." "Almost didn't," Jim replied, embracing his old friend briefly. "Johnson?" Mike's expression told him everything he needed to know. "Centurion broadcast an alert about an hour ago. Armed suspect neutralized at a private airfield. No name, but..." Jim nodded grimly. "He gave us the diversion we needed, bought us the time to get airborne." "Sounds like Marcus," Mike said quietly. "Always putting the mission first." Inside the lodge, they found the rest of the team gathered around a satellite communications setup. Watson monitoring frequencies, Chen analyzing the video evidence they'd gathered, Mendez cleaning weapons with methodical precision. All 3 men stood as Jim and Jennifer entered, their relief evident. "The evidence?" Jim asked immediately. Chen gestured to a laptop. "Secured and backed up to multiple locations, full footage of the test firing, clear identification of Blackwood and the buyers, definitive proof of the radiation dispersal effect, everything we need." Jim reviewed the footage, confirming its quality and content. Chen had captured it perfectly. Irrefutable evidence of what the Fortress Buster system was designed to do and who was responsible for its imminent sale. "So what's the next step?" Jennifer asked. "We can't just walk into the FBI with this." "No," Jim agreed. "Blackwood's too well connected. He'd have it buried before it reached anyone with the authority to act." "We need to go public," Mike suggested. "Wide distribution. Make it impossible to contain." Jim considered this. Going public would certainly prevent a cover-up, but it might also compromise any legal proceedings. The evidence could be tainted by its release, giving Blackwood's lawyers ammunition to fight the charges. "We need someone with the authority to act immediately," he decided. "Someone who can secure the facility and the weapon before Blackwood has a chance to move it or destroy evidence." "The Joint Chiefs," Jennifer suggested. "Specifically Admiral Catherine Walters. She's the vice chair, has direct access to the president, and she's known for her ethical stance. More importantly, she has no connection to Blackwood or his political allies." Jim nodded in agreement. Admiral Walters was respected across party lines, a career officer with an impeccable record. If anyone could navigate the political minefield this evidence would create, it was her. "Can you reach her?" he asked Jennifer. "Not directly," she admitted, "but I know her chief of staff. If I can get a secure message to him, explain the situation, he might be able to arrange a private meeting." "Do it," Jim ordered. "But be careful. We have to assume all standard communications are compromised." Jennifer moved to a separate room to make the contact, using a secure protocol she developed during her intelligence work. The rest of the team continued to analyze the evidence, strengthening their case, identifying every individual visible in the footage. 2 hours later, Jennifer returned. "It's arranged. Admiral Walters will meet us at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. Military transport is being dispatched to a small airfield 20 miles from here. ETA 1 hour." Jim felt a surge of cautious optimism. If they could get the evidence directly to Admiral Walters, bypass the normal channels that Blackwood might influence, they had a chance. "Let's move," he ordered. "Pack only essential equipment and the evidence. Everything else stays." They traveled in 2 vehicles, the pickup truck Jim and Jennifer had arrived in, and an SUV Mike had secured earlier. The drive to the small airfield was tense but uneventful. No sign that Centurion's search had expanded this far east yet. A C-21 Learjet with Air Force markings was waiting for them and engines already running. 2 Air Force Security Forces personnel stood at the base of the boarding stairs, checking identification as the team approached. "Major Harrington?" one of them asked as Jennifer presented her military ID. "Yes. Admiral Walters sent us personally. You and your team are cleared to board. We depart immediately. The flight to Peterson Air Force Base took less than 40 minutes. They were met on the tarmac by a military escort and driven directly to a secure conference room in the base's intelligence center. Admiral Catherine Walters was waiting for them, her four-star insignia catching the light as she stood to greet them. Major Harrington, she said, acknowledging Jennifer first, then turning to Jim. Colonel, your message indicated this was a matter of urgent national security. I'm listening. For the next hour, Jim presented their evidence methodically, supported by the technical expertise of Mike and the others. The video footage of the Fortress Buster test, the radiation signatures, Blackwood's presence, the foreign buyers, all of it laid out with military precision. Admiral Walters watched in silence, her expression growing increasingly grave as the presentation continued. When they had finished, she remained silent for several long moments, processing what she had seen. If verified, she finally said, this represents a catastrophic breach of national security, international law, and basic ethical governance. It's all verified, Admiral, Jennifer assured her. I've personally authenticated the video footage and cross-referenced the technical specifications against classified DoD archives. This weapon exists, and Senator Blackwood is preparing to sell it to foreign interests. The Admiral studied her carefully. You understand the gravity of these accusations? Senator Blackwood chairs the Armed Services Committee. He has allies throughout the government, including in the Pentagon. With respect, Admiral, Jim interjected, that's precisely why we brought this directly to you. The normal channels are compromised. Blackwood would bury this before it reached anyone with the authority to act. Admiral Walters nodded slowly. You made the right call. She pressed a button on the conference table. Colonel Reeves, implement Sandstorm protocols. Full spectrum communications blackout, direct presidential authorization only. A voice responded immediately. Yes, Admiral. Sandstorm active in 30 seconds. She turned back to Jim. I'm placing this entire matter under the highest level of classification. No one outside this room will be briefed until I've personally informed the President and secured the weapon system. With respect, Admiral, Jim pressed, Blackwood knows we obtained evidence. He'll be moving to either relocate or destroy the Fortress Buster immediately. I'm aware, Colonel. Admiral Walters' voice was steel. Joint Special Operations Command assets are being mobilized as we speak. The Centurion facility will be secured within the hour. Senator Blackwood is currently at a fundraising dinner in Washington. He will be detained by military police when he leaves. Jim felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. The evidence was in the right hands, and action was being taken. What about us? Jennifer asked practically. You'll remain under military protection until this matter is resolved, the Admiral replied. Your safety is paramount, especially once Senator Blackwood's arrest becomes public. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of debriefings, evidence verification, and secure communications. The team was housed in VIP quarters at Peterson with round-the-clock security. Updates came regularly from Admiral Walters' staff. JSOC forces had secured the Centurion facility without casualties. The Fortress Buster II system had been located and placed under military control. Documents found at the facility corroborated their evidence, including transfer agreements with the foreign buyers. Senator Blackwood had been taken into military custody, charged with treason, illegal weapons development, and numerous violations of international law. On the third day, Admiral Walters herself came to brief them. The President has been fully informed, she told them. A special prosecutor has been appointed to handle the case. Given the classified nature of much of the evidence, the proceedings will be partially closed, but the fundamental facts will be made public. And the weapon, Jim asked? Being dismantled under international supervision. The UN Security Council has authorized a special inspection team to verify its destruction and assess environmental impact at the test site. Jim nodded, satisfied that the immediate threat had been contained. But there was still one matter that weighed on him. What about Johnson, he asked. Marcus Johnson, the man who died helping us escape, and all the others affected by the original Fortress Buster deployment. Will there be acknowledgement, compensation for the victims? Admiral Walters' expression softened slightly. The President has authorized a special investigation into the original program, including health impacts on veterans and Iraqi civilians. It won't bring anyone back, Colonel, but it will ensure their suffering isn't forgotten or denied. It wasn't everything Jim had hoped for, but it was a start. Acknowledgement was the first step toward justice. One more thing, the Admiral added. The President asked me to convey his personal gratitude for your actions. What you did required immense courage and personal sacrifice. Once the legal proceedings are complete, there will be official recognition. Not public. The classified nature of the operation precludes that, but your service to this country will not go unacknowledged. Jim shook his head. We didn't do it for recognition, Admiral. We did it because it was right. The best kind of service usually is, she replied with a knowing nod. 1 week later, the team gathered one final time before dispersing. The immediate crisis had passed, the legal machinery now in motion to bring Blackwood and his co-conspirators to justice. Each of them would remain under protective custody until the trial, but they had been granted a few hours together before returning to their separate safe houses. They met at a small memorial service for Marcus Johnson, held in a chapel at Peterson Air Force Base. No body had been recovered, Centurion Security had apparently taken it, but Admiral Walters had arranged for military honors nonetheless. Johnson's service record, his sacrifice, demanded no less. After the ceremony that gathered outside in the clear Colorado sunshine, Watson, Chen, and Mendez would be departing first, each to separate locations for their protection. Mike would follow later in the day. Only Jim and Jennifer would remain together, their father-daughter relationship providing suitable cover for their protective detail. So this is it, Mike said, looking around at the team. Mission accomplished. Part of it, Jim corrected. Blackwood will face justice, and the weapon is being destroyed. But the truth about the original deployment, the effects on our troops and Iraqi civilians, that fight is just beginning. And you'll keep fighting it, Jennifer said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. She knew her father too well to think he would stop now. Jim nodded. Someone has to. For Johnson, for Carson, for all of them. They said their goodbyes with the simple dignity of men who had shared danger and purpose. No flowery speeches, no dramatic declarations, just the quiet acknowledgement of bonds forged in the crucible of shared risk. As the others departed, Jim stood with Jennifer at the edge of the memorial garden, looking out over the mountains that rim the horizon. What happens now? She asked quietly. The trial will take months, maybe years, Jim replied. We'll testify when needed, live under protection until the threat is fully neutralized. After that, he shrugged. I've got a museum to run, tanks to restore, history to preserve. Jennifer smiled slightly. Just like that? Back to normal after all this? Nothing will be normal again, Jim admitted. Not after what we've seen, what we've learned, but we go on. We make sure the truth isn't buried again. We honor the sacrifices of the ones who didn't make it. A military aide approached, informing them that their transport was ready. As they walked toward the waiting vehicle, Jennifer slipped her hand into her father's, a gesture she hadn't made since childhood. I'm proud of you, Dad, she said simply. Jim squeezed her hand gently, his throat tight with emotion. I'm proud of us, Jenny. The future remained uncertain. Powerful forces would resist the exposure of the Fortress Buster program and its legacy. The legal battles would be complex and challenging. But for the first time in 30 years, the truth was emerging into the light. For Jim Harrington, for all of them, that was enough for now. They had stopped the weapon. They had honored their fallen comrades. They had done what was right, regardless of the cost. As the car pulled away from Peterson Air Force Base, Jim looked back one last time at the chapel where they had honored Johnson. In his mind, he could see all of them, Johnson, Carson, the rest of his old tank crew, standing together, their mission finally complete. Rest easy, brothers, he whispered. It's over. We won.